Hey, Calvary Academy, it's Pastor Best here. Kind of crazy times that we live in, isn't it? Who would have thought the last time that I was there with you in chapel a few months ago that the next time would be like this, over video? But so much has changed and kind of gotten thrown off in our world, right? The last couple months with COVID-19. One of the things that a lot of people are saying, a word that a lot of people are using right now, is this idea of hope, right? We're saying that we hope for a lot of things, like, man, I hope we get to eat in a restaurant again sometime soon. I hope that this all goes away and that more people don't die. I hope that we can go back to church soon. I hope that we can have school when it starts next fall. And we talk about hope a lot, and the Bible also talks a lot about hope. And it's different because when we talk about hope, when we say, I hope this, oftentimes we just are it's just wishful thinking, right? Because we don't really have any power to control it. But in the Bible, when it talks about hope in the Bible, and when we have hope in Jesus, it's a confident expectation that he will be faithful to his promises. And when we hope in Jesus, it changes how we live today. And for our chapel today, I'm going to look together with us in a story of someone whose hope was desperately placed on Jesus and what it caused her to do because of her hope that she had in Jesus. And so our story today is going to be in the book of Mark, chapter 5. So if you want to grab a Bible, it's in Mark, chapter 5. And the story starts actually in verse 21, when a man comes to Jesus whose name is Jairus. Now, Jairus is an important man. He's an official, but there's something wrong with his daughter, who is very sick. And so he tells Jesus, I need you to come and I need you to heal my daughter, showing faith. And Jesus says, okay, I'll come. And then we're introduced, as Jesus is going to Jairus' home, we're introduced to someone else. So it says this in verse 24 after Jairus, chapter 5 of Mark 5. So Jesus went with him. A large crowd followed and pressed around him. There was no social distancing going on. People wanted to get in close and see where Jesus was going. You can imagine this buzz that was going around. Jesus is going to heal Jairus' daughter. Verse 25, and a woman was there. We don't have a name. We don't know anything about her, but a woman was there who had been subject to bleeding for 12 years. She had suffered a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had, yet instead of getting better, she got worse. When she heard about Jesus, she decided to do something. So we have this woman who had this condition where she was bleeding for 12 years. Now, she would have been obviously in a lot of physical pain and discomfort that would have caused her. But the extent of this disease that she suffered from was more than just a physical pain and hardship, but it had a lot of other kind of implications. One was, because of this, she wouldn't have been allowed to go to worship in the temple. Her religious activities would have been cut off due to the restrictions they had at that time between things that were clean and unclean. So it's been hard for you, and it's been hard for me not to be able to go to church and hang out with my friends and see people for the last 2 months. This was her life for the last 12 years. It also had social implications because in their culture there was this idea of being clean versus unclean. And because she was constantly bleeding, she was seen as someone who was unclean. Kind of similar to how in the Bible we see people who had leprosy. And people couldn't interact with them. It was very similar for her. And so this kind of idea that we have now about social distancing would have been her life. She would have had no physical contact with anyone, including family members, for likely 12 years. And she had spent everything that she had, every single dollar, to try and fix this problem because it was so devastating in her life, but nothing made it better, and it just kept getting worse and worse and worse. She was desperate, but verse 27, she had heard about Jesus. She had heard of what Jesus could do, the miracles that he could perform, and she was desperate for healing. And so she's desperate, so she decides, I have to do something. Verse 27, when she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak. because she thought, if I just touch his clothes, I will be healed. There was this idea back then that for someone who had divine power, you didn't even need to ask for healing, you didn't even need to touch them, but just simply their garments contained power to change someone. And she's so desperate, she's willing to risk this, risk being seen in public, risk going out as the crowds are packed in around Jesus. Just imagine the fear in her as she sneaks out her side door. She covers her head, covers her face so that people won't recognize her because they know who she is and they know that this issue that she has. She sneaks out to finally touch and go out to touch the robe of Jesus. See, when our hope is in Jesus and we're desperate for him, nothing will stop us from coming to him. Nothing will stop us from getting to Jesus. We also have this similar idea of someone desperate for getting Jesus. If you remember the story of Zacchaeus, or you probably at least know the song about Zacchaeus, who went out to see Jesus one day and he couldn't see, right? So what did Zacchaeus do? He climbed up into a tree. Why? Because he was desperate for the hope that Jesus had, that he needed in his life. And this woman is a reminder for us that even in difficult times, because her life honestly was a lot more difficult than even your or my life has become the last couple months. What we've kind of lived out for 2 months, being socially isolated from people and not having a normal routine of life, this was 12 years. For most of you, that's longer than you've even been alive. That's been her whole life. But nothing could stop her from coming to Jesus. And it's a reminder to us that even when times are dark, even when times are difficult, in fact, when it's the most difficult, that's when we need to place our hope in Jesus above everything else. And so she reaches out and she touches his clothes. Verse 29 says this, immediately her bleeding stopped and she felt in her body that she was freed from her suffering. She touches the cloak and immediately she knows that she has been healed. This is a reminder of when we place our hope in Jesus, the power that he has to change our lives. See, when we place our hope in Jesus, it says in several places in the Bible, in the Psalms it says in one place that no one whose hope is in you will ever be put to shame. In the book of Romans chapter 5, it says that those who hope in Jesus will never be disappointed. And her hope in Jesus that caused her to go out and to reach out and to risk everything to touch Jesus, it wasn't disappointment, but she had total healing. See, when we place our hopes in anything that's of this world other than Jesus, ultimately it will disappoint us. Have you ever placed your hope in something and had it be disappointing? I remember many years ago, during the winter when it was really cold and snowy, I think it was one of those years that we had a polar vortex, my wife and I think in January, booked a trip to Florida in March. And that was our hope, that man, winter is awful, but we're going to get to go to Florida. But then when that trip came and we packed our bags and we went to Florida, we found that the place we were staying in was nice, but the pool, for whatever reason, was still like really cold and it wasn't very good for swimming. And that whole week that we were there, it was sunny out some, but it was super windy. And so every time we tried to go to the beach, it was just the sand kept blowing up against us and hitting us every time we had to go to the water. And we thought we would get this super nice vacation of laying out in the sun and it being super warm, and it was kind of disappointing. And really, if we put our hope, not just in vacations, but if we put our hope in anything of this world other than Jesus, saying, this is what will bring me satisfaction. If I get perfect A's, that's what will bring me satisfaction. If I make the basketball team, if I become the best musician, if I do any of these things, that will bring me satisfaction. And that's what our hope is in. Ultimately, all those things are going to disappoint us. But the story is a reminder that when we place our hope not in ourselves or the things that we can do, but when we place our hope in Jesus, we will never be disappointed. We will never be disappointed. She had placed, this woman, all her hope in Jesus, and she reached out and she touched his cloak, and immediately her life was changed. It says in verse 30, at once Jesus realized that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and asked, "Who touched my clothes?" And the people crowding around him, and then his disciples answered, Hey Jesus, we're not social distancing here. There's like probably hundreds of people crammed in around him. And they're like, what do you mean? Who touched you, Jesus? They're like, Jesus, knock it off. What are you talking about? Who touched you? But Jesus kept looking around, it says in verse 32, to see who had done it. Imagine what the woman is thinking. Imagine the fear in her heart. Like she was doing this anonymously. No one knew. She just thought she would touch the robe, be healed, and then slink back away. But Jesus is calling out, who's done this? Verse 33, the woman, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell at Jesus' feet, trembling with fear, told him the whole truth. Verse 34, Jesus said to her, daughter, your faith has healed you. Go in peace and be freed from your suffering. He calls her daughter. Remember, where was Jesus on his way to? To Jairus' house to heal who? Jairus' daughter. But this woman here had no family that would go out for her, no family to speak up for her. But Jesus loved her too much to allow her to anonymously come in and then just to leave. He loved her too much. And so he stops everything and turns his attention towards her. And this is the only place, would you believe it, in the New Testament that Jesus calls someone daughter. See, she came for physical healing, but she left transformed and got this new relationship with God. And it's a reminder for us that when we put our hope in salvation in Jesus, not in ourselves or the things we've done, that we get far more than that. We get the most secure relationship with God ever, and that He is our Father, and we are His sons, and we are His daughters. See, our hope in Jesus is secure because when we follow Jesus, we've been given the most secure relationship of all, and that's we are sons and daughters of Jesus. This is a really exciting time for me and for my family because my wife right now is 8.5 months pregnant, meaning literally any day, today, I could get a phone call and say, hey, we need to go to the hospital. The baby is arriving. This will be our first son or daughter. We don't know if it's going to be a boy or a girl. And we are so excited for the journey that will come ahead of us and the days that are ahead of us. But I can tell you one thing. I don't know a lot about parenting yet, but I know one thing for sure, that I will always love this child. I will always love my son or my daughter, whether it's a boy or girl. Nothing that they could ever do could change the love that I have for them. They will always be mine. When Jesus stops and says to this woman, daughter, it's a reminder to us that when we place our hope in Jesus for salvation, nothing we could ever do could change that. Nothing that we could ever do could cause us to become out of the family of God. And when we place our faith in Jesus, He looks at you and He looks at me and He calls us His sons. He calls us His daughters. We can have hope in Jesus because we've been given the most secure relationship ever. He is our Father and we are His sons and we are His daughters. So in the midst of everything that's been going on in the world, all the craziness of being at home and doing school, and for you 8th graders, there's no graduation probably in person, and we don't know what life's going to look like next week, let alone next year. In the midst of all of that, remember that we can still have hope. Because Jesus, just as He changed this woman's life, Jesus has changed our lives. And He doesn't just heal us from our sin. He doesn't just save us, but we now have the most secure relationship possible, that we are in the family of God. And He calls you and He calls me His sons and daughters. So wherever you are today, wherever you find yourself, you, just like me, can have hope in Jesus because His love for us never changes. God bless Calvary. I miss you, and I hope to see you guys again in the fall.